Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next part of God's big story, which we've been looking at Living Room Church on a Sunday morning. So I'm not sure what goes through your head and maybe even your heart when you look at what's going on in the world around us, when you read the news on your phone or you watch it on your TV. But when we do that, we just kind of see in Technicolor some of the worst bits of our beautiful world just sprawled in front of us. So we see racial injustice and toxic levels of pollution and CO2 destroying so many of the most incredible habitats of the world. We see politicians just lying through their teeth and putting policies in place which damage communities. We see this kind of unprecedented level of greed and consumerism, which means that the rich are just continuing to get richer and the poor are continuing to get poorer, and the inequality between rich and poor is bigger than it's ever been. So, for example, Nestle came out on the news this week that they have taken the fair trade label off Kit Kats, which mean that that the farmers who harvest the cocoa beans are going to get paid 1.6 million pounds less, which is just so unfair and so degrading for a whole chunk of humanity. And of course, we see this global pandemic, which is just wreaking havoc in communities, which has just left a trail of grief and pain, and which, looking forward, we know is going to lead to job insecurity and financial difficulty for so many. And so when we look at that, I think for a lot of people, certainly kind of in history, it is the level of like suffering and pain and brokenness in the world that pushes people away from God. That people say, how can there possibly be a good God when the world looks like that? But in a kind of funny way, I feel like as a Christian and as someone who believes the big story of the Bible, it kind of does the opposite for me. So when I see what is happening in the world, something kind of rises up in me where this conviction, I guess, that man, the world just wasn't meant to be like this, that we as humans are not meant to be like this, that when we're subject to grief and sickness and injustice, there's something that rises up in us. And I think that kind of points to the fact that we feel like the world wasn't meant to look like this, that human beings were meant to be better than this. And then when we kind of examine our own hearts, and I don't know, I hope I'm not the only person that does this, but sometimes when I think about what's actually going on in my head and the kind of parent I've been that day and a judgment I've thought about someone else, I'm like, wow, I'm not meant to be like this. I feel like I have these high aspirations of being really patient and being really kind and gentle and loving, and then I resolve to do it and it all goes wrong. And for me, that just points to the fact that there is something in us that is meant to be good and beautiful, but there is also something else in us that kind of distorts that. So in Living Room Church, we've been looking at God's big story, and last week we looked at the green bead of creation. And we're just reminded that we live in this incredible world. But more than that, that we were made by a creator God who wants relationship with us, that God made us to be in friendship with him, and that he loves us. The story of the Bible is a story of a God who loves the people he has made and who calls them good, who calls the world good. And he says that he wants to be with them and to walk with them. And then when we kind of look at the world, we think that doesn't feel like that's what's happened. And in God's big story, the next bit of the story, which was symbolized kind of by the black bead and this idea of sadness and darkness entering our world in some way, is told in Genesis, in the first book of the Bible, as something that happens to Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve have been created by God in the garden, and they have this beautiful relationship with God. But then the serpent, this mysterious figure, which we also call Satan, and Satan simply means the accuser, he sneaks into the garden. And what he does is he brings this lie into the world. And this lie is really simple. The lie is, does God really love you? And Adam and Eve have been told that they are allowed to do whatever they want in this garden, that they can eat of any tree that they want. But there is one tree that they're not allowed to eat of, and it is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I've heard lots of people talk about this story. And one sermon that really stuck with me was this idea that God says, actually, I'm the judge. I'm the only one who can determine what is good and what is bad. And if you try to be like me, if you try to become judges yourself, then all that's going to happen is you will forever be putting yourself in the position of judge, trying to decide what is right and wrong, and actually judging other people. And certainly when I look at the world around me and I look at my own heart, I think that's what happens. It's like we've all become these kind of little mini judges, and we are determined to say this is right and this is wrong, and that person is right and that person is wrong. And we kind of go around kind of like putting each other down and raising other people up, but just pointing out what's right and what's wrong with people. So back in the beginning, God said, actually, don't eat from that tree, because if you eat from that tree, then death is going to come, sadness is going to come into the world, because by eating of that tree and by disobeying me, actually, you're rejecting me as your king. You're saying, we know better than you, and you are pushing me out. And what happens when the serpent comes into the garden is he whispers this lie into Eve's ear, and he says, actually, if you eat of that fruit, you're not going to die. And he starts to call into question to Eve the truth of that first bead, the truth of the fact that she was made for a relationship with him, that God loves her, that he wants what's best for her. And Eve believes that lie. And as she believes it, she starts to think, well, maybe God doesn't really love me. And maybe he doesn't really want what's best for me. And why did he tell me that I can't eat from that tree in the first place? And so she takes the fruit and she eats from the tree. And she gives some to Adam to eat as well. And then straight away, we see that things start to spiral. So Adam and Eve, who have never felt shame, who have never experienced what it is to be separate from God, they've been his friends, they've enjoyed his company. Suddenly, first of all, they realise that they're naked and they're ashamed of their nakedness. So their beautiful created bodies suddenly are a cause of pain to them. And so they try and cover themselves up. And then when God comes and he walks in the garden and he says to them, children, where are you? And they hide from him. And Adam says, actually, I hid from you because I realised that I was naked. And God is so hurt by this action that he knows that his kids have rejected him as the one who loves them and the one who made them. And then straight away you see this kind of relational breakdown between Adam and Eve, and Adam's like, no, Eve made me do it, and Eve says, oh no, the snake made me do it. And they just start to blame each other. And you can feel this sadness and this sorrow in God's heart, where he says, actually, you've rejected me. You've said that you don't want me as your king. And because you've done that, you can't be in my garden anymore. You can't stay with me. And this relationship just breaks down. And the word that we use for that in the Bible is sin. And I know it's not like a popular word, and it's become a bit kind of trivial, hasn't it? That we say, oh, I didn't, in Weight Watchers, we talk about sins, that if you have too many sins in a day, you kind of go over your Weight Watchers limit. But the word sin in the Bible, it's not really just about the things that we do. So if we steal someone's pen, I don't know why I said pen, but or something worse, that is a sin. But God is kind of trying to explain something a bit deeper about like something that's actually going on in the human heart, where we have decided that we don't want God, that we don't want to be with him. And God says that the consequence of not wanting to be with him is death, that actually we can't live with him anymore, and that human beings will one day die. And so we have this complete mess where this beautiful world is suddenly out of kilter because the relationship between God and humanity has broken down. And as you read the biblical narrative, what you see is that when the relationship between people and God breaks, it's like everything else breaks too. The way that it's described in the book of Romans is that the whole of creation is just longing for the day when things will be fixed again, because everything has gone out of kilter. We see tsunamis and earthquakes, and we see war, we see famine, that from this kind of one act of rejecting God as king, then it just kind of set this series of things in motion where everything breaks down. And so it's a really sad part of the story that sin comes into the world and it separates God from us. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I think when I examine my own heart, I kind of feel that I'm never quite as good as I mean to be, that it almost feels like there is something in me that prevents me from living the life that I was meant to be, from being the person that God created me to be. And the Bible calls that sin. So the next part of the story is this kind of massive problem that helps us to understand the world that we live in. But it is this sorrowful and sad part of the story because it's about brokenness. It's about admitting that we are broken, that we do things wrong, and that actually the root of doing all those things wrong is kind of a rebellion against God, a rejection of God, and a way of saying, God, actually, I just don't want you. I want to be in charge of my own life because I think I can make decisions better than you can. And so God made us to be in this loving relationship with him, but so quickly in God's big story, we see that relationship falls apart, and we're left in a world with the consequences of a broken relationship with God and a broken relationship with each other. So what we're going to do this Sunday coming is kind of look at the next bead, which is the red bead. Here it is. And think about, well, if God made us because he loves us and he wants to be in relationship with us, and that relationship breaks down, then what's going to fix it? What is it that is going to restore human beings to a relationship with the one who made them? And some of you will know the answer to that. But for those of you right now who just want to reflect a little bit more on, actually, what does this mean? What does it mean that we live in this world and that we are people who are separated from God, that sin has broken down this relationship with the one who made us, who loves us? There's two things. One, there's a blog that I wrote about 5 years ago now to kind of try and explain some of this. It's quite long, but if you like reading, then I'll link it to the video. And the second thing is, if you happen to have a copy of this, the Jesus Storybook Bible, then I just really recommend, even if you're an adult, it's definitely my favourite Bible, even as an adult, you have a read of the second story in the book, which is just called The Terrible Lie. And maybe I will try and post a kind of retelling of it up, but it's just such a powerful retelling of what it is that goes wrong, but also of the reminder that one day things will be fixed. And the promise that is made by God at the end of this story, this kind of devastating story where Adam and Eve are asked to leave the garden, is that God says, one day I am going to send someone who is going to crush the head of the serpent. He says, one day I am going to send someone who is going to fix everything that has been broken.